Yeah, I thought we had talked on Skype before, though. But I know we've talked on the phone.
Yeah, that's all I remember. So,
Yeah, it was a while ago. Anyway, so yeah, do you want to jump into where we left
yeah.
off in the comments section, or do you want to start it
Did
by...
you read my reply to your comments?
Yeah, I read them. I didn't want to respond there because there was a lot there, but I guess the gist of it is um, I stand by the initial claim, which is that you're confusing things. You're confusing moral and non-moral values, and I think that that distinction is necessary. I think we
Okay,
make that
so what
distinction.
what would be a non-moral value?
Well, you gave an example of a deer standing on a cliff and being cautious. Well, if a
Hmm.
deer falls off a cliff, nobody says that was immoral of the deer, right? I mean, nobody views that as a moral judgment. They view that as a personal value judgment that the deer makes. Like, oh, that was stupid or that was crazy, but not it was immoral. We use the term to refer specifically to deviations from cultural norms of behavior that are sort of imposed on people by society. We don't use it for something like let's say a person oh, I don't know, let's say a woman is on a diet because she wants to lose weight, but she sees a chocolate cake in a store window, so she buys a chocolate cake and she eats it. We don't call that immoral, but we might call that bad judgment, right?
Hmm. And as a matter of semantic classification and human language, I could stand by that, what you're saying, that morality as we conceive it is basically obedience to social pressures and conformance with social norms. That's morality comes from mores, which is basically custom. So I see that, but clearly, if you watch the video, I'm talking about a more ontologically fundamental level of what we typically classify as moral phenomena. But I'm using it like in a senso lato. It's not just what we mean by morality. I'm saying behind that and underlying it, and the reason for its existence. That is the reason, the raison d'etre of our sense of morality is this more fundamental, ontologically basic fact of a goodness or badness to experience. And I think no
Well,
one denies that.
I think you could deny. I mean, I think I would deny that it's based on goodness or badness of experience. But
No, folk conception of morality is not based on that. But I'm extending the
no,
concept,
no, no.
saying is it okay? So go ahead.
No, I understand. I mean, well, I think what you're doing though is you're extending the concept of morality to include all values. And then you're saying that values derive from this experience of pain and pleasure.
Well, I wouldn't just say pain and pleasure, because there are dissociative states where you can be experiencing great pain, but it's not necessarily bad. So what we mean by the badness or goodness in general of experience is not quite that. But um, go on.
Well, okay. So I don't well, I'm not sure what it would be then if it's experiential. But so anyway, I think I don't think that's what morality means, and I think yes, in a sense moral values emerge out of non-moral values, which themselves emerge out of, well, evolution, reproduction, life, essentially.
Hmm.
But a moral nihilist doesn't deny all values. They just say, I don't think that these, um, well, but they basically say what I said, that our moral intuitions are a reflection of the social environment, and therefore they have the properties that we can observe, such as they're somewhat arbitrary, they're somewhat socially contextual, people are hypocritical about them. So you can go through a litany of these properties that moral intuitions have and that moral behavior has, and you can't explain it as somebody perceiving like real moral values in the world because, for example, that wouldn't explain hypocrisy, right? Whereas you can easily explain hypocrisy, the divergence between people's professed morality and their actual morality, if you understand it as conformity and obedience, right? So I think the point of moral nihilism is to say that, okay, this whole thing is a bit of a lie, it's a bit of a deception. That doesn't mean that there aren't good reasons to do most things that are considered to be moral, and not to do most things that are considered to be immoral, but the reasons are not that they are de facto good and evil. The reasons are that there's a social power structure, and there is a set of norms that we use to organize our behavior socially. And for an individual, it might be harmful or dangerous to violate those norms. And for a society to not have norms would cause the society to fail, right? So I think that's the the realistic position on morality, which ironically is not called moral realism, but moral nihilism.
Hmm. Yeah. And if you have that restricted definition of morality, which arguably is more prevalent, then sure, you'll come to that conclusion. But I think what people, I guess, if you talk to a Christian, their conception of morality is not purely social, it's not purely adhering to custom. It does invade that interior space and get into things that, for instance, St. Paul says that if someone wants to eat meat, then it's not your place to judge them. But the eating of the meat is conceived of in moral terms. So, and that's the way I conceive of morality personally, that all of my actions will have an influence on the fate of my soul, ultimately, which is what we're concerned about. Now, by soul, I just mean the continuity of subjective experience. And depending on your cosmological and metaphysical presuppositions, that may extend beyond the biological life of you as an individual. But I'm not making the claim that we have some kind of omniscience with respect to that actual moral fate of our soul, whether we are good and go to a better place or whether we are bad in an objective sense, bad and go to a worse place. I'm saying that that cardinality to experience and the inbuilt value character of it, in a way that's not merely preferential, but it's a value which is an orientation towards a real point out there that is overall going to be worse or better. So I'm not saying that we know, but we have an intuition that we're at such a fork in the road, and all of our actions in that light can be seen as contributing towards our progression towards heaven or towards hell. I don't really care if you call that phenomenon morality, but I'm saying that that's real and it's the most important thing for each of us. And I think each of us knows that it's the most important thing for each of us.
Well, I guess I'm a little bit confused. I mean, if you're arguing from a Christian perspective, then you have a bunch of presuppositions that I mean, if you're arguing from a religious perspective, then
No, I think this stands outside of religion. No matter what your religion is, or no matter what your belief system is, you're going to have to acknowledge the fact that you're going to have more suffering in the future or less. Like that,
well, I
that is
actually think that's false. I actually think that it does not make
okay.
any difference what you do. Your total suffering is zero. Now, I know that's that's probably a controversial position, obviously.
You're not an eliminative materialist, are you?
I don't even know what that means, but the I think this is a bit of a tangent, which isn't really necessary for the discussion, but I'll just briefly explain what I mean. Um, I think you pay for your pleasure with pain, and there's no way to get it's a zero-sum game. So I don't think there is any net suffering in life, and it doesn't matter what you do. It's all zero. So I'm completely not a hedonist because I think hedonism is completely futile. There's no point living for pleasure or pain. But I can grant you the assumption that there is for the sake of this argument, because I know that's not a very normal view. Um, but I don't actually accept that premise.
Okay.
But I don't want to throw like a huge red herring or curveball at you. Um,
No, that's I'm trying to interpret then that doesn't negate even if you don't have to concede it basically. Like that doesn't negate my system. It just says that there is an answer to that question, which involves a presupposition about the net neutrality of suffering and pleasure overall. And the conclusion of that is that the moral latent quality of actions that most of us feel, who have like a functioning limbic system, what we feel is illusory.
but I
So
don't
it's still
think.
a moral answer. Like if you believed differently, then your calculation would be different. Is
Well,
so
but I
it's
think
positioning in the spectrum.
okay. So, but I think that the what you're talking about is maybe value laden, and I think that pain and pleasure are the experience of valuing. I don't think they are value itself. I would make that distinction. I think value is something out there in the world, and we attach, or it's a relation between a subject and an object, and we attach value to things out there in the world, right? Like you might
Right.
attach
But
value to your child's
what about I
life.
think you can I want to question that definition between subject and object. There is a self-reflexive value to the self without considering objective things at all.
What do you mean a self-reflexive?
I mean, the subject values the subject.
I don't think that's true. I think the subject values the object that it is. The subject might value its own existence, but as an object, I mean, you can't really. Um,
Well, some people may conceive of themselves as an object, but most don't. Most experience like
well,
a soul type
but I think when
mentality.
you reflect on yourself, you're not. It's just like you're not actually seeing a tree. You have an idea in your mind of a tree. Reflecting on yourself is forming an idea in your subjectivity of yourself, but that's not. And the idea, the value you attach to yourself is attached to this idea, which represents you
Yeah.
and maybe even represents your subjectivity. But I think we're probably going down a rabbit hole that we should probably explore some other time because I think this will get um, kind of loopy. Like there's a lot of there's difficult language involved when you talk about these things. But just to go back to this idea, I just want to clarify a couple of things. So I think what you're talking about is, I would say, is value, not moral value, but just value. And so somebody can have value content to their experience, right? Like they want one thing versus another, but not conceive of that as moral. And others don't normally conceive of that as moral unless it involves social constraints, right? Like I gave the example of the deer or the cake, the fat woman eating the cake, right? So I think we make this distinction for an important reason because we have self-interest, but then we have to accommodate ourselves to society. And morality is kind of like a myth that we use to, you know, um, kind of justify and explain why we accommodate ourselves to society.
Sure. Pausing there, but I'm still going to have to question the definition you're giving. Most people in the West probably conceive of moral action to be constrained to a certain social, agential realm, and it matters what the intention is and everything. But I think that in the dharmic um, philosophical spheres, that like the deer being near the cliff and being cautious, that is conceived on moral grounds and the totality of action, like the aesthetic in the wood. He doesn't have to have interaction with anyone, but nevertheless, all of his actions have a grave moral significance for him because it either impedes or facilitates his progression towards his goal, which is the best possible subjective condition.
But why would you call that moral
That's what they call
if
it. I mean,
he's
that's
just pursuing it for himself? And I mean, we're not speaking in their language. We're not talking about dharma or, which may or may not
sure.
correspond here.
In those systems, either you're a Buddhist and you believe that there is no real self in anything. So, kind of like it's all a system of um, desire clouding perception of the reality of things, which is ultimately this emptiness, and the Buddhist pursues that. So the fact that it's all about himself is kind of wiped clean by the fact that they don't believe in the self. Now, with Hinduism um, and Sikhism, I presume, you have a belief in the universality of the self. So, in pursuing that optimal condition for yourself, you're also it's you're facilitating the same Atman or universal soul that's in everyone. And also, the belief is that in your progression up, you bring benefits to the community. So there is a social aspect, but it's really not crucial for the ontology of the ethic, which there is that. And that's really exactly my view. Not that, well,
Okay.
to some extent, I think that the universal soul thing is tenable. But that's definitely not something to get into. But
Okay.
I mean, you can see that
Well,
that conception of morality exists.
I guess I just don't think it corresponds to what we call morality and what a moral nihilist is denying the existence of. Um, I mean, you could. I mean, a moral nihilist would probably deny the existence of the universal soul as well, because a moral nihilist is typically an atheist, and that sounds like a kind of, pantheistic conception of reality.
Right.
Um, but I just want to go through a couple of examples and distinctions that have to do with objective and subjective. So, because this came up in the discussion, um, I mentioned that there are different kinds of subjectivity or objectivity. Like that distinction can be used in different ways. One of them is that value is usually conceived of. So you can, how do I put this? Value is usually conceived relative to a subject, right, or relative to an individual to whom the event is good or bad.
Yeah,
Now
and I agree
that
with that.
Okay, so that could apply to either value that is purely experiential or something that's objective, like really in the real world, right? Like for example, reproductive fitness. I could say, and I'll just use an example. A cuckoo lays an egg in a reed warbler's nest. The cuckoo's egg hatches, kills the reed warbler's babies. The reed warbler raises the cuckoo. Now, this is objectively good for the cuckoo in terms of reproductive fitness or its biological function or purpose. This is objectively bad for the reed warbler, right? So it's an objective measure, which is reproductive fitness, but it's relative to the individual. The same event is good for one, bad for the other. And
Right.
it seems to me that this is pretty important for any conception of value. That value has perspective, and that the same event viewed from different perspectives could be good or bad.
Yes, that's true, considering things on objective grounds, but if you think about the condition of each participant in the interaction, each of them has an objective what's good for them. Now, this seems the same as self-interest, and you're not categorizing that a moral phenomena. But I think you're kind of missing that what I'm claiming is that that is what people think of as morality. It is what we're referring to, and our conception is inadequate.
No, I think that when people use morality, what they mean is that the event is good or bad in itself. So that there is another perspective, some like, God's eye view or whatever, that a certain event like murder, even though it might be beneficial to one person to murder another. So it's beneficial to let's say it's beneficial to the murderer. He gets away with it, whatever. The murdered person is harmed by being murdered. But that there's this other, you know, perspective from which the event can be judged, which is the moral perspective in which the event is bad. It's
Right.
morally wrong, and this is conceived of as an objective perspective, so to speak. And a moral nihilist denies the existence of some objective perspective from which this event is, objectively bad. Its goodness or badness has to be relative to an individual or to someone
And
who.
I don't think we disagree on that. right? An event is good or bad to a particular participant in that event, never just abstractly by itself. But that's, in my view, because there's no such thing as an event in itself outside of the perspective of the individuals. That you can't just remove the observer and have the event still be there. Um,
Well, okay, but I mean, you can still have a perspective that doesn't, that's sort of detached from it, right? That there's this, like a god looking down on it saying, well, you did something, the murderer did something wrong, so this event was wrong, even though the murderer benefited from it.
right. Now, in
And I think without
this thing
that
of mythology,
perspective, there is no
okay.
morality, because without that perspective,
Now,
there's no such thing as
if you're
a,
important to understand that the traditional conception, or at least the Catholic mystic conception, of God's stance on the morality of things, and I think this is pretty general to Christians, it's that God, to God all things are good. And the reason for that would be difficult to get into here, but the fact of the objective perspective, or the God's eye view on the scenario, doesn't weigh into my conception at all. That perspective, I think, is flawed. So again, we kind of agree on that point. Um, what I think is important about the objectivity of the goodness or badness of the event is that to a particular individual, there is an objective truth, to the goodness or badness of the event that's not arbitrated by the individual, that um, there's a logic to it. It's not just evolutionary happenstance, because in order for evolution to occur, there has to be some kind of overarching physical and ultimately metaphysical order in which evolution as a process is coherent. So I'm saying that that inbuilt structure to things includes with it, at some level, and whether you're an idealist or not depends how fundamental you think this level is, but there is a level at which that value aspect comes into it. And there's a logic to it, and it's objective and just as real as any physical phenomenon. Like the moral law is real. And so that's what people would refer to as the arta, or dharma at the social level.
well, but
Um,
I think that's a complete, okay, so I think that there is a kind of law, but the law is whatever reproduces wins, right? So that the ultimate,
and that's what I'm claiming is not the case. It's not merely that evolution produces morality, it's that there is an order to the world which allows for evolution in the first place, and which allows for morality as a phenomenon, experienced phenomenon, to be possible. Right? So there's a structural aspect where reality allows for moral phenomena, not just it happened to be so with evolution.
no, 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 but I mean, yes, the structure of the world, though, is that's what evolution is. It's the structure of the world working itself out. And reproduction is the cycle that creates beings that have value, or perceive themselves to have value, or that we perceive to have value to themselves, right? You see the deer standing on the top of the cliff, and because it's a living being, you assume it doesn't, it's bad if it dies for itself, right? That it's bad for the deer to fall off the cliff. And the reason you perceive it's bad for the deer to fall off the cliff, but not for a rock to roll off the cliff, is because the deer evolved to, avoid death and to seek to reproduce. So reproduction is the crux of value in the universe. And it's kind of funny because we generally conceive of, like, if you truly understand life, our morality is fundamentally at odds with reality. It's like at odds with life. Our morality is effilist, at least in the modern West. But even in the past, it was somewhat effilist because we create these little bubbles, our little societies, that are nicer on the inside than nature is. Of course, we can only do that by being not nice to the rest of the world, by pushing the entropy out of the bubble. Um, so that's the actual order of the world. And I think the actual order of the world is considered evil by most people. It isn't karmic. It's the exact opposite, right? You win by being selfish. You don't win by being altruistic. You don't win by being nice. Um,
Okay, again, in my conception of morality, it's possible that altruism is good. It's also possible that altruism is bad. So I'm not wedding the concept of altruism to morality, although I think there is a general consensus, as you're referring to, that altruism is good in some sense, that it has beneficial aspects. And I think a case can be made that whether it's reproductively beneficial or not, at the sociological level, or even at the psychological level, some people exhibiting altruistic traits um, does have spillover benefits. Again, going back to Buddhism, um, the Buddha in his was initiated into his quest by witnessing someone die. I could explain the myth behind that, but anyway, he witnessed suffering for the first time, and it really got to him. So him being compassionate and altruistic led him to kind of question the meaning of it all, and he went and saw the gurus and everything, and eventually attained that state of meditation that changed him somehow and changed those who followed him, and really did change those who followed him, and had a dramatic impact on society. Now, it may be that that was a leech on society and the Buddhism was not actually advantageous in any sense, but I tend to think that if a religion is around, it's probably because evolution selected for it, right? So, there are possible benefits to altruism, and I contend that it's a likely candidate for one of those objectively good traits to have, at least to some degree. Now, I know you disagree with that from your video, from what you've talked about. Um, but yeah, so it's not critical, though, for my conception of morality. The state of affairs in the world may be such that murder is good, if that is actually, in fact, what leads to the greatest good experience in the long run as you do your calculation. If it's the fact that we only experience this life, then actually reproductive fitness does not come into my model, because you just have to calculate how can I get the best possible scenario experientially as a subject um, during the course of my life. And
Right,
what
right. Well, I mean,
you have survivors, it doesn't matter in this moral context. That's not my.
right. Well, that's a different, yeah, that's another kind. I was going to bring that up, that there's another kind of subjective. So there's two meanings of subjective that apply. One is the relative to a subject, or to maybe not even a conscious being, but like relative to a bacterium. You could say this is good for the bacterium, this is bad. Hydrochloric acid poured on the bacterium is bad for it. Um, there's also subjective in an experiential sense, meaning that it only exists within the subjective experience of the subject. That it isn't measurable. It isn't. There's no sort of objective um, event that it corresponds to. Like pleasure and pain, for example, are subjective experiences. They can be caused by objective events, but they are not objective events themselves, right? Because they are experiential. Um,
Well, just to be pedantic,
which
the
okay.
connection between the experienced qualia of pain and the configuration of your neurons, is that isomorphic in your consideration? Because if it is, then I mean ultimately yes, everything that you're experiencing does equate to some objective reality.
Well, it might correspond to it, but it's still not the same. I mean, I don't know
Okay.
if you could reduce it descriptively, but um,
It's not terribly relevant. I just thought it was,
it's a good. I mean, it's one of those philosophical questions that's pretty hard to answer because um, you get into this infinite reflexivity problem. Like, what does it mean? Like the idea of your limbic system is just an idea in the mind of a subject. You can't escape the subject there either. So the subjective objective distinction is made by a subject, and it's anyway. I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole. It isn't that important, but I wanted to bring it up that um, this distinction is relevant because if you're talking about something like hedonism, you're talking about, then what matters is what subjects feel, right? And so, like, you can have thought experiments. Some of them might be kind of gruesome. Like, we put your head in a vat and we feed you a bunch of information that makes it seem like you're living this great life, and then we nuke the earth. To you, those things are equivalent because your experience is the same, or are they different? Um,
Are what two scenarios
well,
equivalent?
like let's say that you live your life as it is, or we put your head in a vat and we feed it information so that it seems like you're living a normal life. We put you in the matrix,
Right.
and then
Okay.
we nuke the earth and kill everybody and destroy everything. Um, so in that scenario, you're in a vat, you don't know the earth's been nuked and everybody's died, and you're just a head in a vat in a spaceship or something.
Nice. Okay.
Okay, so would you consider those scenarios to be equivalent, have equivalent value to you?
Subjectively, they would be, you could construct the scenario where they would be identical. Subjectively, they are identical, and therefore, morally, whatever the subject experiences is identical in those scenarios by definition.
Yeah, if your value is subjective, then you would have to say that at least for that subject they are identical. But if your value is objective, then it does matter to the subject that his world has been destroyed and all his friends and family are dead, even if he doesn't know about it. That has negative value to him, and so those are two different things, right? Like a less gruesome example is getting cuckolded. If you don't know your kid isn't yours, does it matter, right?
Right. I mean, ultimately, it depends on your theory of an afterlife. So, if you believe that some portion of your consciousness, this is one argument if you want to, preserve an evolutionary framework and don't move to something like reincarnation. If you believe that some portion of what is really your consciousness is actually passed on to your children, then it is significant. And you could say that basically, our genes program our neurons to produce certain experiences, and the genes that code for particular types of experience constitute what, in a significant sense, is your identity. And it's kind of just parceled up, and part of your identity is now in that, even subjectively, now in that other individual, your child. So if that was the case, if that was your cosmological presupposition, then it would be morally significant.
Well,
Uh,
I would just say again, I wouldn't say morally, but I would say because my conception of value is objective, to me, what happens after I'm dead has value regardless of whether I experience it. It's not me experiencing something that gives it value, in my value system. It's the reality
Right.
of the
But you've
event.
already
So
said that there's no such thing as value outside of a perspective. So I think your
no, no,
position's
no, no,
just a
no,
little bit
no, no, no.
incoherent.
I've tried to make that distinction. That's actually that was the point. That there's experiential subjectivity, and then there's relative to an individual. So, like I gave the example of the bacterium. Bacterium doesn't have a consciousness; it has no subjectivity. But we can say this is objectively bad for the bacterium to kill it, right?
Well, but when you say, and I didn't comment on that at the time, but when you say that it's objectively bad for the bacterium, you're talking in evolutionary terms, and you're not talking about what's good for the bacterium. You're talking about what's good for the genes if genes value replication, or if that amounts to a good for the gene.
Well, I'm
Um,
talking about what's good for the bacteria in the sense that the bacteria is an entity that has a kind of intrinsic purpose, which is to reproduce its genes. So whatever works against that purpose is bad for the bacterium. And that's an objective thing. It doesn't involve the bacteria experiencing anything.
yeah.
It's just
So
good or bad. And I was making that point because we talk about the world in this way, right? We talk about what's good for a tree and bad for a tree, good for you know, a squirrel or bad or whatever. It doesn't have to have our kind of consciousness or any kind of consciousness,
right.
but it has to
But
be
if you talk
alive.
to a vegan, they don't care that the chicken will pass on its genes. They care that the chicken is suffering. So I
I
think
know.
most, yeah.
Right. Well, a lot
So
of vegans, right. So in the modern West, we have arrived at a hedonistic conception of value. And I was saying I reject that, so I have a different value system. Um, I would say
which
that,
is basically evolutionary fitness in that context.
yeah, yeah, essentially
I,
evolutionary fitness or the reproducing.
and I'm not saying that's wrong, but I'm saying that's one candidate of what is objectively morally good for all these objects if they have subjectivity. Now, if the case is that the tree has no form of subjectivity whatsoever, then the tree is not a moral thing. It's only moral insofar as it can be used as an object for some purpose for you.
Okay, well, I'm not saying it's moral. I'm just saying that the
Yeah,
tree
right.
is
But
an
you're saying good
entity
or
to
bad. You're
which
talking
value
about
judgments can apply as a subject, even though it doesn't have consciousness. That there's different notions of subjectivity. One is that it doesn't require consciousness, and one does. And that was the point I was trying to make. That they're both of those distinctions matter. They both are relevant to value theories, and I thought you were sort of confusing them. But
Yeah, I don't think so. What I'm saying is that if it's not conscious, it can only have value to you as an object. Nothing can be good for it or bad for it.
yeah, no, I understand your theory. I'm saying I disagree, and I have my theory. A tree, something can be bad for a tree, like getting chopped down is bad for a tree, objectively. Anyway, um,
Now, but is that because it's not then able to pass on its genes, or where does the badness of that come from?
yeah, because that works against the purpose of the tree, which is to reproduce its genes.
Okay, what if it's an old tree and it's not going to reproduce anymore?
Well, then it might not be bad for it. Just like
Okay, so
dying when you're.
now I'm going to have to circle back to say that that's one candidate. What you're saying is one candidate if evolutionary fitness, replication of genes amounts to
in
some
in
form.
your system, yes,
You
but
know
I'm
what?
saying that's my system. It doesn't. It's not. I'm just saying there's a system. Okay, here's a
It
system
doesn't
of
have to be
value.
experienced for it to be good. Okay, so that is a real difference. Now I'm trying to understand how you contextualize that. If there was no one there thinking about the evolutionary landscape, would it still be good for no, suppose that all life was non-conscious, right? No life is conscious. There's no observer with values. Is anything good for the tree in that case?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's just that nobody's around to to think about it. But yeah, something's good for the tree if it reproduces its genes, regardless of whether.
But so there doesn't have to be a human deciding that it's good if genes are replicated. They
No,
have. Now that's strange because to me that sounds like the objective moral claim, and I don't agree with that.
there's no
That
morality to it. I'm saying it's completely amoral. It's not a moral
okay, well you're
claim at
talking
all.
that's semantic from my perspective because again I'm going with a larger sense
Well, I
of
understand. Yeah, I'm just saying, I'm just giving you my system,
what
right? Which
what you're
doesn't.
talking about falls under because you're using the language falls more it sounds like under my conception of morality if you extend it to non-conscious agents, which I do. Like I am a pan proto experientialist in that I believe there's some not volitional in a conscious sense, but willful aspect to all forms. Like the electron feels, in some sense, an attraction to the proton, and so on and so forth with all physical phenomena. I'm saying there is inherent subjectivity in the sense that the attraction and repulsion that all things are engaged in is what we identify as the will, right? So that's just where I'm coming from. And in my view, when you talk about what's good for the tree, you're talking about, does that in some, maybe we can't calculate it, but in some utilitarian sense, add up to a good outcome for the willing subject of that tree? Um, Now, you're not making that leap, and you're just saying that inherently replication is good. Now, where does you're going to have to define that sense of good, and
Yeah,
the
well, I mean, I
point
just
is that you're the one defining it. You're the conscious agent defining that to be good. So it's not good outside of you doing that definition.
well, no, that's mixing up two different things. I mean,
Okay.
um, I'm just defining a system. The things are good or bad. Yeah, the system defines what the notion of value is, but the notion of value doesn't depend on the system, right? It's like
The
uh,
system defines
okay,
value.
it's like you can see the green color of a tree, but it's not your eye that makes the color green emanate from the tree, right? The green color is emanating from the tree regardless, but you can see it, and yes, you need an eye with color vision to see it, but um, so I'm saying, like, the all of our notions of value emerge out of because of reproduction. Your desires, pain, pleasure, subjectivity, all that stuff evolved to make you reproduce. So that's the sense in which it's like the objective purpose of everything that has a purpose. And that's
Right.
one reason why I
Imagine a
mentioned.
scenario, supposing that that was true and that all value was linked completely to evolutionary outcomes. Now, suppose that immortality is invented, successful immortality is possible, and beings achieve it. Now, is replication of their genetic material significant to them at that point, or is their life outcome significant?
Well, I wouldn't say the life outcome. I mean, I don't know what you mean by life outcome.
They're going to live forever. It matters to them what kind of life they're going to have. At that point, once you're immortal, basically, do you care about having children, except insofar as that will perhaps bring you some edification?
I mean, it's an interesting thought experiment, but I think you would only care about surviving. I mean, I think, well, again, I mean, I personally can't. I don't think that it makes any sense to care about your subjective experiences, because they add up to nothing. Everything you experience sums up to zero over the totality of your experiences. It's like when you
Just,
in
just
the
in terms of good or bad, or in terms of everything
in
else?
terms of everything. You can only experience as much blue as not blue, as much green as not green. I mean, everything you experience is sort of pulled out of the void, um, by contrast, right? You're only aware of contrast. Contrast, um, kind of pulls. I'm trying to think of a good metaphor to use to think about it. Something like matter and antimatter. Um, Subjectivity comes from the void, returns to the void, and your experiences are pulled out of the void in by separating the void into equal and opposite, positive and negative amounts, which sum up to nothing over the experience of your life. So your subjectivity sums to nothing. So to me, an immortal being would have to try to do something like reproduce itself, or it would just be,
Yeah,
it wouldn't have. I mean, it wouldn't be immortal anyway. It would sort of, would lose interest in life or whatever. Um, but that's again, that's a tangent, and it's not necessary, um, for us to agree on that. I think to have this discussion, but I just, if I'm clarifying my position, it's quite a bit different, obviously.
hmm
Um, but just let me just give you the example of the cuckoo. So in that example where the cuckoo lays the egg in the reed warbler's nest, the reed warbler's babies are killed. The reed warbler works to take care of the cuckoo. How would you assign your concept of moral value to that situation?
um, for the cuckoo, assuming that it is the case that having offspring amounts to some tangible good for at least a portion of the conscious identity, which I do believe. I don't believe in an absolute continuity of self experience. I think we feel that way because of the structure of memory, but ultimately, like, we're divisible. We're not there's a unity in consciousness, but what we identify as ourselves are the collections of experience that this consciousness is exposed to. And so that in that sense, reproduction does amount to um, a forwarding of consciousness and reproduction to the point where you can overcome predators or something like that. Like if you can, or outcompete your rivals. Like all of that amounts to better conscious experiences, in my view. So for the cuckoo, the moral thing to do is exactly what it does: maximize um, the experience of its species, which involves first, as the sine qua non of that, the existence, the propagation of the race, and then second to that, I think beings do pursue evolutionary outcomes that put their kind ahead in some kind of um, like a relative sense ecologically. Like you want people are organisms are fighting to be at the top of the food chain is basically what I'm saying. And the reason for that, teleologically in my moral system, would be that they're pursuing the best possible future for what they identify as their subjectivity.
Well, they're pursuing reproduction. I mean,
Right, but
not to be at the top of the
my,
food
my
chain.
moral framework, just presuming that it's, if what's significant is the fate of your subjective experience, then that's the only significance of reproduction in this schema. The idea that portions of your conscious identity are actually replicated, or what, not necessarily identity in the sense of the phenomenological present or moment, like maybe individual qualia in all of their specificity and their particular relata with other sense experience. Maybe that's not replicated, but at the very least, the kind of orientation of mind that we take to be constitutive of our individual identity. And I think we do because we identify with our tendencies and our abilities, and to forward those abilities is the same as, or in the same vein as, looking after your own future. So that, you know, if we're going to disagree that the significant part of morality is subjective, then it's probably not fruitful to have this discussion unless I can understand, first of all, why you believe that there is a good and bad outcome for non-conscious agents. It's still not entirely clear to me how you can coherently claim that.
Well, I'm just saying that's sort of by definition, and it's a kind of objective value. So it's really just induced from looking at the world that some things are purposeful and others are not. Some things uh, have the property of acting toward a telos, and others don't. Right? So a deer evading a predator is working toward a telos. The rock rolling down the cliff is not. It might bring about an outcome like erosion, but it doesn't have an intrinsic purpose, and we can perceive that and we can induce that from experience just by observing it and generalizing from what we observe. So it's more of a theory about how the world is. It's a theory of what value objectively is and where it objectively comes from. Then there's another question, which is, what do I subjectively, personally value? And those things don't have to be the same. But again, I'm trying to understand your position, so we don't have to go down my rabbit hole. I mean, because I think that's a bigger discussion than will fit into this. But I'm just trying to understand where you're coming from. Like, so you understand my criticism of what you're saying. First of all, is that I don't think what you're talking about corresponds to what people use the word moral or morality to refer to. It's something more general, right?
Okay, and I wanted to address this earlier, but specifically what people think of in terms of an objective morality is the objective goodness or badness of an act. And that's true. But if you take it within an idealistic framework, which I hold, then that objective nature of the moral phenomena, or the event, the objective moral character of the event, is what they think it is in my frame of reference, in that the portion of their experience is colored by that moral intuition. And that moral intuition is as real as the sense data that they're receiving. Now, where they're wrong is saying that outside of my subjectivity, there is an event, first of all, an actual differentiated spatial temporal event outside of consciousness, and then second of all, that the morality jumps outside of that. So it is what people mean. Like this, the experience of moral intuitions, in my view, is one tool that consciousness has to approximate best possible futures for itself. And that extends beyond just the immediate self, insofar as we feel bad about social scenarios that don't necessarily directly impact us, but which impact the character of society. So we have a vested interest in terms of how we'll experience the world in the sexual proclivities of others, even if it's not our business. It matters to us, and we experience it as moral because our intuition is telling us, like, this is significant for the future of your experience and, your children's experience.
Well, let me give you another example.
It is what most people mean by morality. They're just wrong about what they're referring to. But what they sense is what I'm talking about.
Okay, well, let's take an example of a moral intuition that I think is a little bit less abstract. Like someone who says, "Oh, our society should let in the dreamers, the illegal immigrants. We should let them stay because they just want a better life. They need a home. We're wealthy. We're a wealthy society, so we should let them in." Now, what is that moral intuition a perception of, or a recognition of?
It applies probably primarily in terms of the disposition of the individual, as far as like it's good for the sake of being altruistic, and the state of the soul which is altruistic is what they're in fact intuiting is good. And if you look at these people who donate to charity, like they do experience cognitive payoff, maybe not reproductive or evolutionary payoff, but there is some kind of subjective reward for altruistic behavior. As a rule, most people experience that reward. So that's number one with DACA. Like, why do people sympathize? Because they want to feel like they're good people, and that feeling like they're a good person is real and does weigh into the moral calculation that I'm talking about.
Okay.
Um, Now,
But why
beyond that,
now?
they might believe that the kind of society that will be loving is the kind of society that does this, and they want to exist in a loving social space. But once again, it all comes back to what's the kind of future experience I can anticipate, and intuiting against doing ruthless things at the level of government may just be a way of safeguarding themselves from ruthless experience.
Okay, now what about when that person sees a homeless person sitting on the street near their home and they don't have the moral intuition that they should let that person into their house? How do you explain the distinction between the two scenarios? Why do they have one moral intuition when they don't directly pay the cost and a different one when they
Right.
do?
I'm not saying that moral intuitions are magical. I think they're evolved, right? And our intellects are evolved. And these are imperfect mechanisms, but what they're about is the best possible circumstance for the individual at a primary level. So like if you're going to talk about the scenario at a biological level of abstraction, then it that the male of the species feels good about getting the female, except insofar as it incentivizes that behavior. It's not as significant. The subjectivity is not as significant. But talking about it from the problem-solving perspective of the moral agent, that experience is what it's all about. Most people are not, and most organisms surely are not thinking about like their genes, because for most of evolutionary history, no organism on Earth knew about genes.
No,
So
no,
that's
but
what they're concerned with. They're concerned about their subjectivity, and that's the basis of moral phenomena.
no, no,
Fact
hold
of the
on.
future, the condition of your subjectivity.
Well, hold on a sec. They're not concerned about their subjectivity either, because they don't have any conception of their subjectivity either. What they're concerned about is eating, or you know,
Right, which is a subjective
escaping, or
experience.
no, they're not
They want the
concerned about
experience
the
of eating.
no, hold on. They're not concerned about the subjective experience of escaping. They're concerned about literally escaping, objectively escaping. Objectively, the concern is subjective, but the concern is attached to objective reality, right? A deer is not afraid of the experience of the lion or the tiger or whatever. It's afraid of the lion or the tiger, right? It has a
Right.
perception of
You
this thing out there in the world, and it wants to escape from that thing. It doesn't think to itself, boy, I really don't want to have this subjective experience of being eaten. It's just like, I don't want to get eaten. Or, fuck, I better
right.
get out of here, right? Like,
I think that at the level of, if you're going to trace this back in evolutionary time, there has to be a point where the organism was not capable of making that inference of like what happens when the tiger gets you.
well, yeah,
It doesn't
sure.
conceive of being
No, no, but I mean, the point is that there is some psychological thing going on, which could be purely instinctive, or it could involve, um,
right. And
hold on, experiences
same
of
as
pain or
sure,
pleasure that affect decision making, which is how it works for like higher vertebrates, right? We have models of reality, and we attach value to events and objects in the model, and we navigate the world in that way. So that's where that consciousness comes from. A spider might just instinctively run when it gets carbon dioxide on it or something, right?
yeah.
But the desire, it's all instinctive at some level, right? Like the desires themselves are instincts, and all the instincts were evolved to make us reproduce. Um, so no matter how far you want to go back or how deep you want to go psychologically, it's still based on that biological foundation of reproduction. Uh,
Yeah.
just because we
If
don't.
you go to your theoretical framework, but if we're talking about the evolution of moral phenomena, it comes from ultimately that instinctive layer where they're not thinking about the effects of the events in question. They are just absorbed in some kind of visceral, subjective um, suffering or pleasure or anticipation or fear or whatever it is. All of those qualia are there first at an evolutionary level. Like that's the gap between, um,
That's
you
the
know,
mechanism, that's the driving force. I mean, it's those
that's why
psychological.
organisms behave in the ways that they do. And what we experience as morality is just an evolved form of all of that. And it's refined and abstracted um, beyond the level of any other life form.
Well, what I would say we experience as morality is a subset of that, which is the subset that relates to the social environment. I think moral phenomena are a limited subset of our value phenomena, and they consist of things like guilt and remorse and shame and embarrassment, all that stuff that are all social in some sense, that go
Yeah.
back to our conditioning
I think
by others.
I'm with you on what you're saying there. I understand because you said before that was your definition of morality, but that definition is not ubiquitous. And if you consider the ethical systems of the East, of India, basically, and that's so influential. It really does. It's not. It's like I don't know if it's half and half, but a large portion of humanity is under the impression that morality is this more like all-encompassing thing, where there is ethical significance in all of our action.
Which you could call dharma, right? Correct behavior. I mean, that might be the best term for what you're
No, because
describing, or
dharma is social. So dharma is more like what you're talking about is morality. But there's a connection between individual karma and an abstract arta or cosmic order, and that cosmic order is moral itself. Um, and the karma feeds into that moral order at an individual level, whether or not this has to do with any dharmic function.
well, I think what that is it's more delusion. I mean, I think it's projecting our social, it's kind of projecting society onto nature and seeing in nature what the way the social order of our societies or the order of our societies. But you will in your system though it does not seem to correspond even to that Eastern view because I mean I don't know what they would say about the cuckoo bird. Is the cuckoo bird doing the right thing?
Well,
Is the reed warbler is it because it's bad for one and good for the other, so it can't be good or bad. Period. Right? It has to be good for one and bad for the other, and therefore it's either in your system. I guess it's morally ambiguous or morally vacuous. I don't know.
um, there are moral truths about the case, but what they are depend on what we're going to assume about the nature of the world. Now, what the Hindu would the the reason we differ would be that the Hindu would be incapable of stepping outside of the cosmological presuppositions that are their faith. So, of course, they're not going to question whether or not there is a universal soul. They're not going to question reincarnation or any of that. So their moral conclusions will be relatively fixed. So if they look at that evolutionary scenario, they're going to give one definite answer if they believe that they can make the calculation in their framework. And what I'm saying is that there is a definite answer as far as this limited question, which is what is the future of the consciousness of the organism or perspective in question. There is a future of the consciousness, and I'm saying that at an evolutionary level, that's where morality came from. Our drives are towards futures, and we seek better futures. That's what organisms do. We seek the futures that are incentivized by our emotional systems, right? So, like, that is the basis of moral phenomena if you trace it back far enough. And on top of that, some people in the West have a conception of morality, which is this social thing that you've discussed. And has to do with like yourself as an agent, all of which is abstraction layered atop a more ontologically basic fact of the reality of that consciousness and its future. And there is better and worse. Now that you disagree with that basic presupposition that there is such a
Well,
thing, a better or worse future.
I disagree with the idea that there's a better or worse subjectivity. But I mean, that's a secondary point. I mean, my original criticism was that it was confusing, right? And that
It is confusing. I
it is
acknowledge.
confusing. Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, I think it's a valid criticism. And the confusion, which I'm just trying to parse out, is it comes from what I've identified, right? That the meaning of moral is different. I mean, you have to develop your system, and then you have to say, okay, here's my system, and this is what I mean by it. I'm not sure how you would say something like let's say, um, dropping a nuclear bomb on two Japanese cities. I mean, would you be able to make a moral judgment about that in your system? Would you be able to say murder is evil in your system, or
I wouldn't
torture
be able
is
to
evil?
calculate it. I can't do the moral calculus, and it's a similar framework to utilitarianism, and it's just that it's extended beyond the pleasure pain dichotomy. I think there's some more fundamental general goodness and general badness, and I don't want to specify any other particular cognitive um, state beyond that. But anyway, so yes, you would evaluate the person who drops those bombs. Are they making a moral decision in that will this ultimately pay off for them? And that's, within the utilitarian framework, you also have to understand, like, I wouldn't just leave it at this, because my conclusion is not that different from nihilism if you're going to say there is an objective morality, but no one knows it. Because then, I mean, no one has the grounds of making any objective moral claims. But you can make objective moral claims if you include cosmological presuppositions, which is why it's hard. Like the moral judgments that I would make would involve my cosmological presuppositions, and it's not just a matter of the payoff for the individual in their biological lifespan.
Yeah, but you also couldn't say that any event was right or wrong, morally good or bad. Period. It would always be relative to
Yeah,
some consciousness, right? And
but I
then you
also
have your
no
assumptions
event
about.
no event exists outside of perspective on it. Only perspectives on events exist, not events in the abstract beyond any perspective.
um
That's like relativity. There's no
well, that's
velocity
not
without a reference frame.
well, that's not. Yeah, but there are events without that are independent of reference frames. There's just no way of perceiving them, right? Relativity doesn't mean that there are no events or velocities. It just means that you're
Not
it,
relativity on its own. Yes,
I
that's
mean,
more metaphorical, the connection.
um
But
yeah, okay. Well, again, I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but I'm just saying that your morality or moral system or whatever, your theory as you've presented it, your moral theory does not allow a person to make what we would normally consider to be moral claims, like it is wrong to murder, or it is wrong to rape, or it is wrong to, throw babies into wood chippers for your own amusement.
no, they can make those claims about individuals. So I can say it's wrong for you to murder, and this is why. And you have to explain then a cosmological schema for interpreting that moral evaluation. But you can always make the claim. You're just either going to be right or wrong about it.
Yeah, but I mean, you would have to make it for a perspective, right? You would have to say, okay, I can't say this is actually, wrong or right. All I can say is that for you, this would be wrong because it would have this negative impact on your consciousness or your future extended consciousness or something like that, right? So you would ultimately you would bring it back to selfishness from a perspective, right?
Yeah,
And
that's exactly what Christians do. Christians want to get into heaven. They know that heaven is exclusive, and they know that billions and billions of the vast majority of humanity is not going to make it there. They're going to suffer for all eternity, but they care about getting into heaven. Christians are absolutely selfish. And I'm saying I said in the comment, that is, every moral system boils down, if you actually look at the judgments that they make, is identical with what I'm talking about. You just have to like plug in their cosmologies to see what they would solve for.
well, the modern West's morality, the altruistic morality of humanism, as I would call it, doesn't seem to fit that very well because you're supposed to care about others for the sake of others. You're supposed to, be willing to sacrifice your experiential welfare for others, but then there is this claim that you'll get some kind of experiential benefit from it. There's this sort of vague claim in that, it's the greatest happiness is in helping
Every
others, blah blah.
social justice warrior is moral in the way that they are because they expect to be treated better because of it. Like in a behaviorist kind of interpretation. I don't care what they think what they think about it. What they're actually doing is trying to calculate for like what should I signal? And you know that that's the
Oh
case.
no, of course, but I mean, I think that they would deny that, right? So their conception of morality, I mean,
Is
that's the whole point of my, of moral nihilism, is saying this conception of morality is a lie, and the reality
their
is we're
conception of
selfish and we're doing it for our own purposes, and we have this mechanism in our brains that evolved to make us reproduce and that generates selfish behavior, and all the stuff we call morality is really conformity and obedience and seeking some sort of benefit for yourself or to avoid some kind of harm. That's what
right.
it ultimately is.
And
Or
it's similar. Our frameworks are very similar. It's just that yours is restricted to an evolutionary biological framework, and mine is kind of speculating beyond that. Like, if your evolution is real, cosmology is true, and your notions of what constitutes value um, are because when I'm talking about my morality for non-human actors or systems, like it's the same thing fundamentally that you're talking about when you're talking about the goodness or badness of
well,
a particular outcome for the tree or for whatever. So we're talking about the same thing there. So you differ on that, and you differ on the fact of like you can't think outside of evolution. But I think I can fit your model basically within mine. You are a special case of my model.
well, I'm not so sure that's true, but let's just, I mean, I don't think it really matters like what my model is, because the the criticism I'm making, and I don't see any real response to it, is that you seem to be a moral nihilist. I mean, I think your
No,
theory is not.
the fact that it's just subjective or the fact that it's evolved does not take away from the fact of an inherent logic to the goodness or badness of future conscious states. Like there is a way to a better future, and that's what religions are about. It's about finding the way. Like that's the belief. There is a reality to goodness and badness in the future for yourself, and that's what the Christian cares about. There's a reality to heaven and a reality to hell. That's the argument. So that's how it differs from nihilism, in that I think that that's just as ontologically basic as evolutionary processes or anything like that, because clearly it exists and the structure of reality allows for it to be such. And all of that, our drives concerning attraction and repulsion and fear and pleasure and pain and everything that incentivizes us to act, all of that subjective domain is real and important, and important insofar as we define our moral frame. So, like, we experience that moral evaluation of our own condition, and that's what morality is, and there's a real logic to it. So that's different from nihilism.
Well, I mean, I just think that okay. I mean, I think if you look at moral intuitions within your own system, if you look at what is considered to be a moral intuition, like I shouldn't steal, right? Take a moral intuition like, oh, I shouldn't steal from this person, or I shouldn't cheat on my spouse, or something like that. And you look at what's the psychological underpinning of it. It's fear, and it's desire for reward, fear of punishment, conformity, obedience, previous conditioning, etc. All selfish, all based on maximizing the individual's perceived benefit and minimizing their cost as they perceive it. And you would not disagree with that.
No.
You would not say that no, they perceive it as some sort of real moral good out there, and they're trying to they're sacrificing themselves for the sake of this moral good. You would just say no, they're just pursuing their own selfish interests in a context. So I think that pretty much is what moral nihilism is. So I think that the distinction doesn't really
The distinction is that
like, what is the distinction between what I just said and what you believe? I don't think there really is one.
if you take just the special case, then effectively, yes, there is really no distinction. Because if all that matters is the future of the individual in their lifespan, then it's the same as being selfish. And if you could do a great calculation for what's going to lead to the best scenario for yourself, then then you would be being moral under my definition, given your presuppositions about the nature of the soul and the nature of identity and whatever the universe is like, whether there's an
Well,
afterlife
you could
and
also
such.
just look
But
psychologically at how did you get the moral intuitions in the first place. And I would say you learned them from experience. You learned them from punishment and reward. You learned them
not
from
all.
imitation.
Some of
So,
it's instinctual too.
yeah, well, there might be an instinctive basis to it, but I mean, people will steal when they can get away with it. They'll murder when they can get away with it.
Not
So,
everyone will steal when they can get away with it.
well, I mean, most people do, and in cases like where it's easy to steal, like cheating on your taxes, there's, you can look at the cases where it's easy and it's hard, and you can see a gradient of stealing. The easier it is, the more stealing there is. So I think you can look at these things and understand the psychological mechanisms that are involved.
Well, leaving aside like my notion being identical with nihilism or not, why don't we just consider whether Christians have what you would consider to be a nihilistic moral framework? Because they are concerned with their own individual future and maximizing the benefit for themselves.
I've
They want to.
never heard a Christian say that. I think I've never heard a Christian put it in that way, and in my experience, Christians believe that they are good because they're supposed to be good, and that's what you're supposed to do. I've never heard a Christian say that they are good because they want to get into heaven. They will threaten non-believers with something like that. Um, I think you can also just look at the behavior of Christians and recognize that they don't actually believe in heaven. I mean, like, if they really believed in heaven, they wouldn't be cautious at the top of a cliff. Um,
Well, I mean, okay, they have obligations to their family and stuff like that, but
yeah, but
belief is never all or nothing. Like there are gradients of belief, and people entertain some notions within an ideology and entertain some notions within another. And almost all Christians you're going to meet today are caught halfway between materialism, secularism, and Christianity. So you would expect them not to live up to their beliefs. But there were martyrs at a certain point in history relatively regularly. So I think these people believed in heaven, and that's why they were willing to die to get the outcome that they wanted. And people,
yeah,
Muslims, do the same thing today.
sure, but you
So
have to also recognize that those are the rare exceptions, and if they weren't, there wouldn't be any Christians
those are the
or
true
Muslims.
believers, right? But
Right, but they're always, but
it
the
fits
ones
into
that,
my scenario. The ones who really believe in the cosmology act out the moral prescriptions of the system.
and
And
then
if you
get
don't really believe in the
removed by,
cosmology, you don't.
okay, but then they get removed by natural selection, which suggests that the cosmology is a lie because, it doesn't actually represent whatever the order of the cosmos was. And the hypocritical people are actually more in sync with the order of reality because they,
The possibility remains that one day the clouds will open and the trumpets will sound and Christ will come down and the dead will be resurrected. In that case, the fact that they didn't pass on their genes is irrelevant because they come back as a conscious agent. So like, and probably that's not likely, but so,
okay, well,
but the
fair
point
enough.
I'm making is the Christians do abide by what I'm saying. So it's unless you're going to call them nihilists,
Well, I'm saying
they don't
most
believe in
don't.
the
I'm just saying
nihilists.
that the vast
They're
majority
maximalists.
don't martyr themselves, and they don't. Um, yeah, they're hypocritical about their faith. The same way people are hypocritical about morality. That there's a professed faith, and then there's an actual behavioral faith, and those two things are different, right? There's revealed preferences and professed preferences, and they're not the same. Um,
Yeah, and
but
I evaluate people's real preferences as far as possible because it's easy to delude yourself about what you really value. But what I'm saying is like what your deepest conviction is, as far as the cosmological framework goes. People always follow what they anticipate is the best for their consciousness in the future. And where now we've tread this ground already. But where you go from that is to say that it's not nihilism because there are cosmologies which allow for the future of your own consciousness to be self-same with the greatest good for the world. Now you have to establish very specific definitions and specific cosmological parameters, but when I plug in my system of cosmological belief, which, as in the case of everyone else's belief, is not absolute. Like I entertain various notions and I have my suspicions and everything like that. But anyway, if you plug in mine, then altruism does have a moral value, and most of the tenets of Christianity, like wives obeying their husbands, husbands loving their wives, like all of the traditional morality stuff, is the right kind of action in the vast majority of cases.
Yeah, I would agree that it is a lot of that is actually the right kind of action. I think the Ten Commandments are a pretty good set of guidelines. However, they encompass two separate things. One is what is good for society, and the other is what is good for the individual. Um, and there's no commandment that says thou shalt eat enough food that thou does not die, because you don't need to tell people that, right? Um, so you got to take that into account, right? It's a set of things that are layered on top of people's short-term and self-interested views to give them a somewhat longer-term perspective, and also, or to give them better longer-term outcomes as individuals, and also to make society function. I think that's
Right.
what the traditional moral systems are there to do, and I think they're very effective, or were very effective until recently. But anyway, that's a
And
little.
in this system, that traditional morality would be one source of guidance for the subject. Another would be their moral intuition or conscience. And like in the Christian framework, a lot is left up to the inspiration of the Holy Spirit and the inspiration of conscience and what God tells you in prayer, which is just tapping into your intuitive systems. Although it's not just that, if you take my cosmological views. And then the other part would be our intellectual rationalizations of the future. And, we're carefully considering which signals we should trust. If they conflict, what do we go with? And all of that is an attempt to get at a true answer to a true question of what's best for the future of my consciousness, and or just the best for the future of, it's possible to set up a scenario where the future of your offspring is the most important thing. It all just depends on how you define um, consciousness ultimately and individual identity.
At
But
one point,
yeah,
you said what is good for the world when you were talking about altruism, and I'm not sure how you would like make a judgment about what is good for the world.
okay. Because, in my mind, the world, i- beyond the level of where it actually is in some form of causal connection with yourself, is in a superposition of possibility. So we don't exist in one space-time universe with objective properties outside of us, um, out beyond the realm where observation collapses the wave function. Basically, it's all a superposition of possible worlds in which we live. Now, I also hold to the notion that the cosmos is large enough that all of those possibilities amount to actualities somewhere somewhere or other. Now, you, through the anthropic principle, are exposed to those cosmoses, which you could be exposed to have a coherent view of the world. Um, so, given that, the future of the world is linked to the future of yourself. If we're going to define a world as that which we're in causal interaction with, and Buddhists take this same logical step, um, the world for a Buddhist is what you're interacting with. And the future of that is self-same with the future of yourself as an individual because the whole is an integrated system. And that's, it's not the same as self-serving because you can deconstruct the concept of the self and the subject-object duality within these parameters and still be able to arrive at objective moral truths. So it's
Well,
not about
hold on.
one
So
specific subject.
the cuckoo and the reed warbler are in causal contact with one another, but that doesn't mean that there's a single perspective that, a single moral perspective or value perspective in that situation, right? I mean, just because they're causally entangled doesn't mean that there's a good for the system that includes both of them.
And what I'm saying is the system is only ever perspectival. It only exists from the perspective of the cuckoo or from the perspective of the warbler, and these are in all but one instance entirely different. So if you have a span of like 5 seconds of consciousness from each of these individuals, um, the odds that you're even talking about, like the warbler that the cuckoo interacts with at one moment, is in some sense not the same coogler that I
Warbler,
forget which
warbler.
animal, yeah, warbler. I was talking warbler it was interacting with in the previous moment. So this is difficult to conceptualize a little bit, but the system is the perspective, and they're entangled to an extent where you can't talk about the interaction of the two outside of the perspective of one or the other.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons I didn't want to go down that whole subjective rabbit hole, because it really does get rather complicated. I mean, I think the whole multiverse, wave function collapses when we observe it thing is it's an inaccurate metaphor that covers up our failure to understand what's going on at the level of at the subatomic level or with quantum physics. I don't think that this is a truth. I think this is a very flawed metaphor that has no scientific meaning. Like, it just doesn't mean anything.
So, would you say you're a materialist, or
I don't know what that means really. I mean, I guess but I just wanted to say about the multiverse thing. I just want to be clear that this is just um, a metaphysical supposition that was attached to quantum theory to kind of avoid a paradox. It isn't something we know is true or have any reason to believe is true. It's just something that was attached to quantum theory to try and get around the fact that it's sort of paradoxical.
I don't I don't subscribe to the notion because it comes from quantum theory. I subscribe to the notion because that's what perennialist faiths teach. Like that's what Hinduism teaches in essence. The world is projected by the Atman, right? So there's one soul, there's one fundamental reality, and the world is all it's an idealistic framework, right? It's an idealist framework, just like Schopenhauer's philosophy, just like Kant's philosophy. And idealism is strengthened through the lens of quantum mechanics, and there are a bunch of different physicists from different fields, loop quantum gravity and string theory and everything that are converging on similar notions of informational reductionism, or the notion that like the observer cannot be disentangled with the system, and that the system is in some fundamental sense constituted by entangled quantum superpositions in Hilbert space or Hilberg space. Hilbert, I don't know, Hilbert space. So like there's a lot of people from different fields that converge on this cosmological view, which is why one of the reasons why I like it. I also have my own arguments for it. So it's not just about quantum mechanics.
Okay,
And
well,
so
I
you
will
have
just
a materialistic framework. I have this framework. You can't.
I will just say
If you
it
can't
is
decide,
metaphysical and it is intrinsically unfalsifiable, so it's intrinsically unscientific. And I just want to make that point that it has no implications for what we observe, and therefore it has no meaning. Um,
no,
you
it has
can
no
posit it.
it has no inherent scientific meaning in that it may not have predictive validity, but it also might have predictive validity. And there are certain circumstances that would lead me to think that it could. I've listened to some people talking about explaining synergy, or is that what you call it? Not synergy, synchronicity, coincidences and stuff like that. Explaining that mathematically using quantum mechanical language. So it could have explanatory power if some of these views are correct. So I don't think it's meaningless, but it doesn't have to be scientific to have a moral significance. And that's my whole point here. Whether it gives explanatory value in empirical or scientific sense is it doesn't really affect whether it impacts you morally, how you're going to decide to live.
What's kind of funny about this is that um, you're actually a sort of objective reality nihilist. So that's kind of interesting because you're basically denying that there is any objective reality, um,
Well, no, there is an
independent of the
objective
subject.
reality. The objective reality is that there are these entangled perspectival systems, and there are perhaps an infinite number of them. I'm not sure, but there is such a system. Like it's not when I talk about my perspective and the collapsing of the wave functions I'm exposed to, like I'm talking about a world in one colloquial sense of the term. But there's also the fact of like, well, at the broadest level, what is out there?
It's
And all the different behaviors
quantum
will also.
intersubjectivity, I guess, is one way to describe it. I mean, it's an interesting idea, but I think it's
It's
um,
not necessary for the moral framework that I'm talking about. But if you accept all of this other, because the reason we got into this was that you asked why I could believe that altruism would be best, not just for the subject, but for the world as a whole, or how the
well,
outcome for the subject could converge with the outcome for the whole.
I'm asking how your moral theory could be used to make moral claims because it just doesn't seem like it could, and that's just an example of where I think it diverges from what we call
Well,
morality. But I
the
mean,
moral would be like it's always conditional. It's still going to be conditional because you need cosmological presuppositions. Like if the fact is that belief in Jesus leads to heaven and absolutely everything else leads to hell, then objectively I can make the moral claim that belief in Jesus is a moral good.
yeah, well, I get that, but I mean, it's like moral claims that involve you know actions, like
Condition.
the kind of moral claims people typically make, like you shouldn't steal, that's bad, don't cheat on your spouse, don't you should be kind to strangers, all these sorts of things, don't torture bunnies for your amusement, or what vegans would make, don't eat meat. That was how this came up, I guess, right? The discussion between JF and
Mhm.
vegans or something like that. I mean, how would you make a moral claim like you shouldn't eat meat? I don't see how that could ever be derived from your
Yeah.
your kind of
Well,
theory, right?
the problem is that you're dealing with an abstraction and a class of objects or a class of events, and that's always going to break down at some extreme. So that there's an inherent um, there are inherent problematics regarding making moral claims in the abstract. But I think that you could still make the case, like the previous case with belief in Jesus. Like if it was the case that adherence or matching the abstract action or the idea of belief in Jesus, if correspondence with that leads to heaven, then it's a one-to-one mapping of our abstraction and the eventualities that partake of that form. But then the form itself, belief in Jesus, would be good. So those arguments are possible. Um,
Well, but like, let me just contrast this with, like, say how Emendum would say that eating meat is wrong.
yeah.
He would say that it's first of all, he would say that causing suffering is bad. You should, suffering is bad. That's his core value, right? That suffering is bad for the experiencer of the suffering. And then there's a moral principle, which is basically altruism, that you should not that you should act to minimize all suffering and not just your own personal suffering. And then he would have to make the argument that, well, by eating animals, you're increasing the overall amount of suffering, right? That's how somebody like Amendum and most vegans, I think, would arrive at that kind of claim that you're increasing the total amount of suffering, and so there's this clear thing. It's experienced, but it's objective in the sense that it can it's a bad that is objectively bad, right? Like, even though it's a subjective experience, they would claim that it doesn't matter who feels it, whether you feel it or somebody else. In that sense of objective, it is objectively bad,
Uh,
um, and therefore you should act to minimize it, and that's why you shouldn't eat meat, right? And so that's a pretty clear-cut moral
there are
claim that follows
two
from that perspective.
levels two levels to that I'd like to address. One is that Inmendum has his his beliefs and his justifications for his beliefs, which are imperfect, and then underlying that, he has his actual moral conduct, which is informed by his intuitions, his beliefs to some extent, and prior experiences and stuff like that. So, and in the actual moral calculation, the reason he's not eating meat is that he's feeling better because he's satisfying a moral instinct, which you get. So I believe that you can influence your moral intuition through your belief. Like if you believe in something long enough, eventually you'll intuit for things that are in line with that belief. So in terms of what he's actually doing, he's abiding by my system. But where obviously his reasoning is fallacious, and I agree with that the reasoning is fallacious. But the second level analysis I'd like
Well,
to.
I just hold on. I don't think the reasoning is fallacious. I don't agree with his premises there, his two value premises.
No, the gap in logic is that suffering is bad for me, therefore suffering is bad.
Yeah, although I don't think I think
That's a
he
gap in logic.
it's more of a premise. I think that's just his fundamental moral premise. That
Okay, yeah, if right.
and so he has two fundamental premises. One is that suffering is the or basically pain and pleasure. So it's hedonism, right? Pain and pleasure are by definition good and bad. So value is corresponds directly to the experience of pain and pleasure. And then the other premise is that is basically altruism, that one ought to minimize, or basically one ought to
Yeah,
maximize value for every sentient being, not just for oneself.
so I get that. Yeah, I get what you're saying. That's not illogical, but the reasoning whereby he arrives at those premises is. I think that he must encounter some kind of logical fallacy on the way to the belief that, um, you know, altruism is good in the abstract.
Well, yeah, I think he pulls both of those out of, he just assumes them, and they seem self-evident to him. I
Okay.
think that's where they come from. I don't think there's like a logical error. More, it's just an assumption. But I mean that's an example of how somebody makes a moral claim. Your system cannot make a similar kind of moral claim, right? Like that's I'm just saying it is possible to have very clear-cut moral claims that follow from a moral theory.
Well, it does make a similar claim in that we were kind of agreed, me and Mendham, that suffering is intrinsically bad. And there's semantic issues here with how you're going to define suffering, because it's not just going to be pain, because I mentioned before there are dissociative states where pain is not necessarily bad. But if we talk about suffering as this overarching badness of experience or goodness of experience that I was alluding to before, that is ontologically bad, and that's my kind of axiomatic moral claim. And given that it's not just we happen to not like it and maybe some other creatures like it, like, no, badness in the abstract is bad. And I think that's tautological. Because if you're going to make any kind of argument in the thought experiment here saying that, well, suffering is valued negatively by these creatures, but maybe there are creatures that have a positive value to suffering, well, then you're just switching around what we mean by suffering
No, no,
according to
no.
that.
What I would say, and here's what I would say. Um, Suffering is valuing. It is not value. That I don't think any organism actually values or doesn't value suffering. And you value things. Like you don't want to be tortured. It's not that you don't want to suffer. I mean, I don't think we go around
I
thinking
think
I
it is that
don't
you
want.
don't want to suffer because you don't have to know what's causing your suffering to want the suffering to go away.
Well, you kind of do. I mean, because if you're going to act, right? Like again, this is a psychological mechanism that we evolved to make us act. The whole point of it is to point us in a direction and say, stay away from that and go toward this, right? So it's really the thing out there that you value, like food. You want to eat. You don't sit around thinking, boy, I wish my hunger would go away. You think, man, I'm hungry, and that makes you want to go find food. And it's
If
the food and the eating of the food that you value. It's the event. It's the thing that solves the problem that you attach value to. It's not the
Yeah, and we went over this, and I'm
yeah.
saying
So
it's always experientially well, obviously the experience of the thing, never the thing itself that organisms value. But beyond
well,
pain,
again, I'm disagreeing with
in
that, but we can set that aside.
sure. What about someone in the hospital who's sick of an unknown illness? They have no idea what's causing their suffering, but they're crying out in pain. They're expressing their desire to alleviate this suffering, and that's qua suffering. That's not because it's an illness.
No, no, but it's still like, let's say you have appendicitis. I mean, there's a pain in your body somewhere, right? And the thing, yeah, I mean, obviously the suffering drives us to do things that reduce suffering, or that's kind of how the motivation system works. But what it drives us to do things. So, I mean, anyway, I don't know. It's kind of a
Yeah, it
problem
does
with
drive. It has a
language. Like
moral imperative.
you
Suffering is attached to a moral
I
imperative.
do not call it a moral imperative. What I think is it's a
It's what I'm
mechanism.
defining as a moral imperative.
I
I'm saying that's
understand.
what is underlying moral imperatives, and that's what people mean ultimately, or what they're trying to refer to with their systems of morality. The fact of the suffering, and the fact of approaching it or moving away from it.
Well, I don't. Okay, well, so we disagree on that. I don't think that is what people mean by moral imperative. But also, the point I was making about suffering is it's a valuing event. It's not the value itself. So I think you do not have to believe that pain and pleasure have value in themselves, but they will always be part of the event of valuing something, because that's how we
Right.
value things. That's the distinction I make.
It's not pain and pleasure though that I'm talking about. You have to abstract from just pain or pleasure, because you can again imagine a scenario where pain is wanted by some perspective. Some organism experiences pain as a positive thing. What I'm talking about is that overarching, like, net total value of experience in general, incorporating pain, pleasure, and everything else in
No,
it.
well, but I would say then it's not pain. I mean, if you want it, it's not pain. Because wanting
No,
is
I think it can be pain. Neurologic, you can light up all the same nerve centers in the brain, but if you happen to also be on morphine, maybe it's not suffering,
then you're
right?
not lighting up the same nerves because the morphine is blocking the morphine is
Yeah,
removing
it
all
won't
of
be
your.
identical. It won't be identical. But patients experience, they can, all of the sensory information, like where it is, what kind, like pain tells you a lot about what's going on in the given part of your body, right? So patients can still give all of that valuable information about the nature of the pain as an experience, but it just doesn't get to them because it's blocked from that nerve center or whatever.
Well, okay. I mean, like, I guess we could just there's a difference there, and that's not entirely true, I don't think. But even if it were, the the way I'm using the term pain is just anything that has a negative emotional quality. It doesn't
All right.
have to. So hunger is a kind of pain. Depression or like feeling sad is a kind of pain. Um, and it has other aspects that are attached to it, like hunger is attached to a desire for food, but
Right.
what hunger has in common with stubbing your toe is this negative emotional experience, and which creates a motivation to do something about it or not to have it happen again or whatever.
Okay, so when you're experiencing one really bad pain and you like pinch your skin or something like that to distract yourself and temporarily seemingly feel better, is the second instance of pain not pain then under your definition?
Well, it's not increasing the amount of pain. Like, I mean, if you're pinching yourself to distract yourself from say some other thing like a memory that's causing you greater pain. I mean, I don't know because I don't do that. So I don't really know. I'm trying to imagine a scenario where something like that happens, but
And there are
um,
masochists who
like,
enjoy the feeling of pain, you know. So,
yeah, well, no, I mean, the masochist doesn't. What the masochist does is it gets a kind of sexual arousal from certain kinds of physical pain, but
yeah,
the
he enjoys it, and that's enjoying it.
no, 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 hold on. No, it gets aroused, then the has an orgasm, enjoys the orgasm, enjoys the sexual release. So has developed this process by which overall the person is seeking pleasure, seeking a positive emotional experience, but along the way they go through.
Yeah. So what you're defining as pleasure and pain then are what I'm talking about as a net overall goodness or badness
Yeah, I
experience.
think that's fine.
But
Yeah, yeah.
I, that I differentiate my position from hedonism in that the way I understand hedonism is in this more restricted sense of bodily pleasure and pain,
Sure.
which are different things. But
Okay.
anyway,
But I mean, Amendum's thing, whatever he wants to minimize, is all overall total negative emotional experience, right? And that's what the vegan is thinking about with the animal as well.
yeah, and I'd say that's a universal thing. Um, it's every possible perspective dislikes that which is negative, and that's tautological. So
Yes, that is
that says suffering
tautological,
is
right?
bad. Suffering is bad tautologically.
No, no,
Yes.
no, no, no,
Well,
no.
no, the totalizing. Okay, when I say suffering, I'm talking about the same thing you defined as pain.
Suffering
If
is
it's
suffering tautologically. I mean, it's not bad tautologically. It's the perception of bad. Okay,
it's it's
it's
the
value.
reference of badness. It is what we mean by
Again,
badness.
let's set this aside because I think it's a rabbit hole. I can talk about it later, but I disagree. I think it's valuing. The negative emotional experience is a negative valuing. It is not a negative value. The value is out there. I,
But the experience is valued.
no, that's what it's valuing. The experience is valuing. It is not valued. You don't like. Here's a good example. After you experience pain, when it's over, you don't say, "Oh man, boy, I sure wish I hadn't experienced that pain." Because now, once it's over, it doesn't matter. You don't go back and say, "Well, if only I could go back and not experience the pain." What you say is, "I wish I hadn't fallen down the stairs and stubbed my toe." Right? Anyway, I think this will
I
just.
don't know. I mean, suppose that you were, in a torture chamber for the course of your natural life, and then you're released and you're told that you're going to live for one day outside. I mean, I'm sure that you would wish, oh, I wish I hadn't spent my life being tortured,
Yes, but
right?
you wouldn't say, "I wish I hadn't experienced the pain," because that's not
No,
the
I think
thing.
that would be exactly what it's about, though. You would say, I wish I had a more pleasurable life. It's not because it's torture. Like, if torture was pleasurable, then maybe that would be a great life retrospectively.
Yeah, but it would be the life that you value and the suffering, not the suffering. I think this is just not gonna. We can discuss this some other time, but I don't want to go off on a tangent. I'm just saying I don't agree. We can just leave it there, I think, and go on because I think it's just gonna be too difficult to to like
Yeah.
explain in.
Well, okay, so moving on then, would you agree that there is a fact of badness to experience in the first place versus goodness to experience in the first place?
No,
Am I
no, no. I've already
defining?
said there's no goodness or badness to experience at all. It is all.
Well, you said that in total,
Yeah, in
but in
total, yeah.
a given moment
The same
is
thing applies.
it's
There can't
always neutral.
there can't be any value to it because any value you get out of it now is borrowed from the future. So or taken from the past. Like it doesn't matter. It's all irrelevant. It's zero.
Well,
Subjectivity is
that obviously contradicts at an intuitive level our experience of being in a good mood versus being in a bad mood, being tortured versus,
no, no, no. It doesn't because those are in the moment. You don't want to be tortured, but that's because the whole point of the pain of torture is to make you get out of that situation, right? That's the point of the psychological mechanism. It's to
yeah,
make
so
you avoid torture.
you don't like that overall scenario, and there are other scenarios that you overall do like.
Right, you don't like being tortured. And that's what the suffering of
No,
torture
but
is.
it's
It's
not
you not
just
liking it. It's the
okay.
valuing, it's the negative evaluation of it.
But overall, I mean, the the moment of experience of being tortured and the moment of experience of having sex, those are not equivalent in terms of their overall goodness or badness, and that doesn't pan out neurochemically either. I mean, the chemicals that are present when we experience positive emotions are not equally distributed across
Well,
time.
no, I'm
Sometimes
just yeah, I'm saying that the experience just doesn't matter. I'm just again, this that we don't have to get into this, but I would attach zero value to any subjective experience. The point of sex is, to reproduce. The bad thing about torture is it damages your body. The reason you don't like torture and you like sex is because sex makes you reproduce and torture harms your body. And the negative evaluation of those things is experienced as pain in one case and pleasure in the other. But that doesn't mean that the subjective experience is valuable. And again, I think this is just going to be.
Well, you don't have to say that the subjective experience itself is valuable to say that the sum total of objects experienced um, is overall more or less negative or more or less positive across time.
Well, it's going to add up to zero over time. But
Over time. But okay, so then that's what I'm saying. Like in between different moments of your life, you have ups and downs, right?
right,
There are
you're
positive and
positively and
negative moments.
negatively evaluating your situation. You have different
Okay.
desires at different moments. So I'm just saying I do not. That's not what I call value. So we don't have to get into that. I mean, you can just present your view. I mean, we don't have to.
Yeah, no, I'm trying to. There are different I think that you would agree to exactly my view given the right definitions of terms. That's what I'm suspecting here.
I don't know. Well, is that
I
what you're trying to do though? Are you trying? I'm not sure like how we got off on.
Well, because I'm saying that the view that I'm espousing, the fact that there are positive and negative evaluations of current states in general, and that they hold tautologically, which you're not going to agree to because you're kind of changing when we're talking about bad, when we're talking about value, when
When
we're
you
talking
say
about pain.
evaluations, I mean there are evaluations. They're just not. I'm just not saying that they're value. That there's a difference between evaluating and value. That's the distinction.
Um, yeah, and I'm not saying that each moment of experience is somehow value itself. I'm saying each moment of experience is more or less valued by the subject of experience. The net total of all present things in your phenomenology amounts to a more or less positive overall impression to the subject than any other moment. Like they're different. Moments are different in terms of their net total goodness or badness in my terminology.
Well, I'm not going to agree with that, so
But
we'll just
I
have to
don't
move on.
because you already said that. You
No,
said
no, no,
yes,
no, no,
there
no,
are
no. I said
differences.
the difference is whether it's the valuing. Like at any given moment, you might be positively valuing or negatively valuing your situation, more or less.
Yes, and that's what I'm saying. So
Okay, well,
you're calling it valuing,
eh,
which whatever.
I'm
But
just saying that the
it's
value.
ontologically basic.
Well, I mean, the point where it has to be distinguished is that there's no value in the experience. In my view, there's zero value in the experience. The experience has no importance whatsoever. It's not the experience that matters, and to you it does, and that's a big distinction. So I think we'll just
Um,
have to let it sit there for now, because
I don't. Yeah, I'm not sure what like the experience as a whole matters insofar as it's a precondition of every other form of mattering to you. So to the individual, it's the absolute fundamental level of everything that matters because without that experience, you have no notion of value whatsoever. So
well,
it's
but
yeah.
again, I mean, look, we're just going to go over the same things. Like the tree has, it's good for the tree to not get cut down, kind of thing. The tree doesn't have to experience it.
No, but you're not as far as you are concerned, your existence in the first place is it's a precondition of you thinking about the value of the tree,
Yeah, but it's got nothing to do with the actual value to the tree of getting cut down. Me existing or not doesn't affect that.
right? Which kind of speaks to your not thinking or not allowing for the possibility of anything other than like persistent external material reality kind
Yeah,
of
I guess. I
operations.
mean, I don't. Yeah, we probably don't agree in that more fundamental. Well, there's various ways in which we don't agree, but I mean,
Yeah,
we don't have to resolve all those differences now. Or
clearly not. But what I'd like to do is at least get you to acknowledge what I am substantively proposing that I think is undeniable at a phenomenological level. That like any subject would agree that that their negative valuing of their experience is what they care about right? And it does give them moral imperatives. And that, and I know you're going to
You
change
know,
your
I
definition.
can't agree with it
I
though.
don't care
So,
about the definition of this term, but you have a concept equating to what I'm talking about here as a moral imperative. The point is, I'm talking about real, like, this is empirical stuff in a larger sense of
well,
empiricism. We
what
can
you
count
call a
some.
moral imperative is just a desire. I would call it
Um,
desire.
yeah, yeah. Well, in this context, in the comments, I talked about another kind of moral imperative in that there is a real consequence to not following your better moral judgment. Like if you go for short-term pleasure, knowing full well that it's going to result in long-term pain, you desired in the short term that more beneficial outcome, but morally you intuited and maybe admitted to yourself that you understood that there was an overarching moral imperative or true presence of real consequences at a larger time scale as a repercussion of your action. So that's really the kind of moral imperative that matches more closely to what people mean by a moral imperative. Like when they talk about God, like the Christian God, you have to believe in Jesus is basically a moral imperative. And the reason is, well, why you're disobeying God if you don't? Why is disobeying God bad? There's nothing whatsoever in the Bible or in any Christian's mind that makes it bad, except that being outside of God's good graces is bad for you. It has bad consequences for you. So I'm saying that maps the self-interest and getting that not necessarily short-term desire, but long-term what's best for you. Achieving that is always the same as the moral thing to do if you are thinking about someone's long-term cosmological perspectives. So, just in the abstract, can you agree that if you know someone's beliefs about the future of the world in total, like what they, and not necessarily what they espouse that they believe, but what they actually, in a concrete sense, expect to be the case, whether subconsciously or consciously, all of that produces a kind of imperative from their moral faculties, which involve intuition and reasoning. All of their moral faculties create an imperative towards some better in their own, in the sense that they value those future states better. That goes on.
Yeah,
That is
well,
something.
people, yeah, well, what you're describing is evaluating. People evaluate courses of action, outcomes, all kinds of things, right?
Right. But it's not just that they evaluate, it's that those evaluations can prove to be correct or incorrect.
Um, Correct or incorrect? Uh, I'm in the
Like I
sense of,
expect, okay, so I expect, say I take up smoking because I genuinely believe it will improve my quality of life. Like I'm wrong, empirically wrong about the consequences of smoking. Now, as I actually do this, I experience the punishment of not being um, accurate in my moral judgment before.
you
Previously,
subjectively experience it. You mean you experience more pain than pleasure?
yeah, in
Right.
my judgment, my moral judgment about the morality of smoking would
But
be wrong
but you're
if
saying it
that.
would be wrong if you experienced more pain than pleasure from smoking.
Yeah, if my expectation was that I was going to experience more pleasure than pain from smoking, and it turned out to be the other way around, again, that decision is a moral judgment in the sense that I'm using the term.
Okay.
So
Well, I mean, I would claim
you
that
can be
it makes
factually wrong.
no. Okay, so I would claim that that then every moral judgment, what you're calling a moral judgment, which I would simply call a kind of, well, I don't know. I don't think that's how we make decisions by like actually thinking, does this going to cause me pleasure or pain? But every single one of them would be wrong because not a single thing you could do would change the amount of pleasure and pain that you experience. Because
If
as
you
I've
believe
said at the
in all
beginning, it's all going to add up to zero, and I know that for a fact. So,
now,
I mean,
that would be
I can.
where we fundamentally
Well, yeah,
disagree.
it is. It is. I know. I mean, that is a fundamental disagreement. So, I mean, that's why I can't agree with you, right? Because we fundamentally disagree on subjectivity and what it is and what's possible to happen within subjectivity. But I
Now,
understand what
this
you're.
is what I was saying before is that you can agree that your opinion on the net neutrality of future experience does have moral implications in an objective sense, in that you could be objectively right about that, or you could be objectively wrong about that. So your moral judgment of it doesn't matter because it's all going to be the same anyway for me. That is moral judgment that you're making, and it could be wrong. It
I
could
don't.
turn out.
No, no, but hold on. I don't make what you would consider to be moral judgments in that way. I value things in spite of the fact that I believe they have no effect on my subjective experience of pain and pleasure. And so my supposed moral imperatives or moral judgments, which I wouldn't call moral, my value judgments have nothing to do with me thinking I'm going to experience more pain or pleasure. They
And
might.
I'm saying that you're probably wrong about that. Like maybe at a
No, okay,
conscious
hold on. So
belief
they
does not
might, just a sec.
your
So
intuitive
yeah,
experience.
psychologically, there's obviously the value emerges out of emotion. So you have to feel pain or pleasure to have this, to have value judgments, that they come from that. So in a sense, you could say that they are the expectation of future pleasure and pain. And yet I can rationally know that they aren't, or that they are perhaps, but only within a context, not overall. Okay, so um, and I can value, and people value things that are like people. This is what I was saying. We don't value pleasure and pain. You value things that happen outside of your experience. You're going to value what's going to happen to your children when you're dead.
Yeah,
You're going to
I
value,
think
and I value what
we're getting
happens to the
a digression.
world, right?
That's a digression.
Well, it's a
Because
very
I think
important one.
eventually. Okay, go ahead.
Well, it's an important one because you do value things that you are never going to experience.
I don't think that that's actually true because you can't value something that's not an experience.
Well, you value your children living after you die. People write wills. They value what happens after they die. They value their legacy. They value people
They
value.
value they only value what they're there to value. So while they're writing the will, they value the thought of their child. While they're with their child, they value the sense data they get from them. They value all that actual stuff, and they what they value is a mental model of them. They don't ever value the thing in itself. Like
Well, see,
we
that's where
some
I think
theists like
that's
to.
maybe the semantic difference, but to me, that's valuing. So the value model in your brain is part of the process of valuing something, but the thing you value is real. So what you value is whether your child lives or dies. It's not the model of the child living or dying that you value. It's the actual event, but the mental model is the medium through which you value the thing in the real world. Okay, so there is a really important distinction there between, like, the whether it's the thing in your subjectivity that you value, or whether it's a subject
It,
object
whether
relation.
whether the value actually extends over the semiotic relationship of the thing signified and the signifier in your mind is like that's hard to prove, and I don't know how you would.
Well, it's
So
more of a definition, and it's the way the terms are used, but it's just the way we could just say it. That's the way I'm defining value. Okay, that the value is an attachment to some real thing. You of course can't directly, apprehend reality. You have to do it through ideas. But valuing um, is a relation between the subject and some objective reality. That's what
yeah,
valuing is. And so the value, just like the truth, is out there. Okay, so the truth is something out there. Now we construct a model which is not necessarily 100% accurate or whatever, but there is a reality out there that we apprehend through a model. That's the experience. That's the truth relation. A subject can have a model that more or less corresponds to reality in some way. Not, correspond is a bad term, but is predictive of reality. Explains it, predicts it. And so value is a similar kind of thing where you have a model that attaches this subjective thing of valuing to an objective reality. And so I would say you value what happens when you die. So you don't value your experience, you value what actually happens in the real world.
I think in a technical sense, you only actually value the thought of these things. You don't value anything after you die because you're not there to value it. Like the future that is supposed to exist after you die, that doesn't exist until after you die. So you're not there to value it when it exists.
So can you believe in something that exists after you die?
You can have no belief if you're dead.
No, but while you're here, can you believe that, say, there will be a tree in a certain, growing in my front yard after I die? Like, let's say I'm going to die tonight. I believe
Yeah.
there's a tree, and I'm going to believe that when I die, the tree will still be there.
You believe that a relationship is present between your model and the thing, and that's where, but there's doubt possible
Okay,
in there,
so
which is
that's a
why, like, I
truth.
don't,
Okay, but that's a truth
yeah,
judgment about the future after I die, right? And I don't have to be subjectively experiencing it for me to have that truth judgment. Well, I can have the same kind of value judgment about something that I'm not experiencing, and that is going to happen after I'm dead. I could say, I want the tree to be there in my front yard after I'm dead, or I want my ashes to be scattered, on Mount Olympus or some
yeah, but
crazy
if
thing,
you look
right?
at the way you're phrasing that, what you're talking about is a condition of your psyche in the present moment.
So
The
is the truth
true
judgment.
of
So is
presence.
the truth judgment. But it still has a reference that is real. And so does the value judgment have a reference that is real.
No, because the reference in the case of the truth judgment about the existence of the tree is not including a value relationship or any kind of relationship between the observer and the tree. It's saying for some other observer, the tree might be there.
Yeah, but the value relationship is valuing from the perspective of the subject now something that
Yeah.
happens in the future. And that's the whole one of the points of value is to value things in the future because then we work toward them. So I mean, we're always in a sense valuing things in the future, right? It's always a relation between the subject now and a reality in the future.
But we're not actually in contact with the future insofar as we're valuing. What we value is the experience of ideation of the future.
But I'm not in contact of the tree in the front yard tomorrow. Like if I die tonight, I'm not going to be in
And that's
contact with.
true, which is why like
So I'm just point.
epistemological doubt or like Cartesian doubt is possible.
Well, of course there's doubt, but that's not the point. I'm just talking about the use of the terms. I think it's very meaningful. There's a meaningful use of the term value to say it's a relation between a subject and an object, just like it's meaningful to say truth is like a relation between the subject and an object. I can have an idea, a truth judgment about the future after I'm dead, and I can have a value judgment about the future after I'm dead. And both of those are relations between me and an idea that mediates this and something out there in the real world. And it's not independent. My truth judgment about the tree is not independent of reality.
Well, it's not independent of reality in general, but it is possibly independent of particular realities,
yes, but
particular
it is
counter.
about reality. And I'm saying the value judgments are about reality. They're not about your subjectivity. And that's that's like the crux of the disagreement, really. It's whether, you know, but
Yeah,
anyway,
well,
we
I
have very
wanted to say
different
that, that
views,
was
but
there's one thing I would like to put in before that digression, and the reason I wanted to avoid it was that I didn't want to forget it, but luckily I remembered. I think your notion that it sums to zero is actually like it's disproven at the margins, because you consider the sum total of your it must be to zero in the past as well. I'm assuming. Um, well, the next moment I live
no,
is
no,
going to be yeah. Go
I know
ahead.
where you're going, but no. I mean, I've thought this through quite a bit. No, let's say any pleasure you can experience in the next moment is going to be conditional on pain you have already experienced. Because you have to have a motivation in the first place to experience pleasure. Like just the hunger, for
Yeah.
example. You have to be hungry to enjoy eating a meal. So you've already paid for whatever pleasure you're going to experience. Now, pain is a little bit harder to make the argument for. But
Oh, I think you're not seeing actually where I was trying to go with that. So
okay.
imagine that you've paid your suffering and you're hungry and you're about to eat a meal. Now, at that moment, someone puts a bullet in your head. Now, parallel universe, same scenario,
No,
same individual.
I've thought about all
Oh,
this before. Yeah. No, I was just
well,
going to
then
get to
they
that.
go on to eat the meal.
I was
That
just going to
meal
I was
was
just
better
I
than the
was
suffering that
I was
preceded. Right?
just gonna get to it. Hold on. So if you have some kind of motivation, and I mean, the way to think about this, right? In the moment the bullet goes in your head, the suffering you're experiencing disappears. Okay, so like you can think of
But the
that as a
suffering experienced doesn't isn't undone.
well, you can think
Fact,
of it as a release, I mean, you could sort of argue in the very last moment of your experience, like let's say you're being tortured to death, right? So maybe you experience what, you maximize your motivation at the very last moment, and then you never get to experience the pleasure of the suffering going away. Well, but in a sense, the death is the pleasure then, because the suffering goes to zero. You can quibble about it, but the thing is,
This goes to
after you're
zero. When you eat, it doesn't just go to zero, it goes to some positive number.
no, hold on. What happens? No, there's two different things. Again, I knew this was gonna like get really involved if we got into this. Pain and pleasure are experience of change of motivation. They're not experiences of like some state. Like you don't if you eat an orange, the amount of pleasure you're gonna get is gonna depend on your existing state of mind. Are you hungry or not? If you're really hungry, eating an orange is gonna be fucking amazing. It's better than sex. Okay. If you're really not that hungry, it's not great at all. If you're full, it's not even good. It's negative. Okay. Pain and pleasure are experiences of changes of motivation. So basically, mathematically, the sum of the changes in motivation, if motivation starts at zero and ends at zero, which I think is a reasonable assumption, the sum of the changes is by definition zero. Because it's going to go up, and then that's pain, and then it's going to go down, and that's pleasure, and it's going to go up again, that's pain, and then down, and pleasure. It's going to zigzag all over the place. But no matter what happens, in the long run, it's going to add up to zero. Now, you could quibble about the very end, like, well, does it count if, like, does the moment of the bullet going through my brain and erasing my pain count? Okay, you can quibble over that. But, of course, by the time you're quibbling over it, the whole thing has already vanished. Right? The whole subjectivity is gone poof. And also, I would point out that whatever pains or pleasures you've experienced in the past are gone. Right? You can never re-experience them. They don't stack up anywhere. They don't accumulate anywhere. You have memories of having experienced pain or pleasure, but you don't experience the pain when you experience the memory. Right? Like, I mean, I had a bad fall on rocks when I was doing some stupid thing jumping on jagged rocks, and I have a big scar on my hip because I fell on a jagged rock. Well, I remember that being incredibly agonizing, but I can't experience that pain now, right?
I think if you model it well enough, you're going to have sympathetic feelings from that.
Yeah, you can sort of imagine and you get a little bit of a queasy feeling, but you certainly can't experience it again. The point is, it's all transient. I think, you could quibble over the very last moment of your life and how you're going to add that up. But again, you're not really adding it to anything. And by the time it's over, there's nothing to add it to. Right? So subjectivity is a totality. And because everything in subjectivity is relative to everything else, there's like a fundamental sense in which the totality is zero. Because you can't measure anything within it.
Pain and pleasure as changes in motivation. I'm not sure that I necessarily agree that it's always a change in motivation because.
Yeah, well,
I'm not. Hunger. You elaborate on what exactly that means to say that
hunger,
because it changes in motivation, it sums to zero.
Well, hunger is the simplest example. I mean, it's a very important emotion. You feel hungry, right? And when your hunger increases, you notice this increasing, negative. This sort of increase in hunger is a negative experience. And this creates this creates the motivation. So that is an increase in your motivation to seek food.
It does increase the motivation to seek food. But what I'm seeing is that it starts out as a small hunger. Now you have a motivation to a certain kind of activity at that point, a slight one, and it gradually increases. Now by the point when you're starving, like the pain of starvation is not just about motivation. It's also about it physically could be hurting your stomach lining because it's digesting itself or whatever. Like that pain from the hunger has a physical correlate. It's not just a change in the motivation.
Well,
like, in my mind, pain and pleasure are states of the body.
It's associated with various sensations, like an internal sensation such as burning in the stomach or whatever. which is another kind of pain, which is added to it, right? That's another motivation. Um, but if you take a I don't know,
It has
antacid.
motivational, the pain has motivational implications, but it itself is not just the change in motivation. That's its telos, that's its purpose.
No, no, no.
Of
I think that is what pain is. It is an increase in motivation. Like that's what I mean by every negative emotional experience is an increase in motivation. Um,
it amounts to that, but I'm not sure that subjectively that they can't be parsed. I think the two concepts can be analyzed and they can be shown to have different features. Like the actual experience of the pain has a qualia characteristic. Like I don't know how to describe it. Like because usually you describe things visually or in terms of shape and stuff like that. But your colors and or rather your emotions and your sensitivities have intrinsic qualitative features that are different than, oh, now I'm going to go eat an orange. Do you get what I'm saying? Like they're different things.
well, I'm not sure I understand what you're saying, but I mean, hunger. The idea of eating an orange is an idea. The hunger is a feeling. The negativity of hunger is pain, and the negativity of it comes from this motivation, this creation of a motivation to eat. Once you have the motivation, you start trying to do that thing, right? Start trying to eat.
Yeah, they're okay. Well, that's kind of post hoc. That's a post hoc fallacy because the fact that they always are associated does not imply
Well,
that.
it's
Well,
not a
it
post hoc
might imply.
fallacy. It's a
No, it's not.
theory. It's a psychological theory of what's going on. I'm just telling you this is the theory of how this works.
Given
And
that they're always associated, the pain and the motivation, it doesn't follow that the pain is the motivation. And I haven't seen. To me, those
I
seem
didn't
like
say it
different
was
things.
the motivation. I said it
Yeah, you
was,
did.
no, I said it was an increase,
Change. Okay, it's a
a
change.
change. And the pleasure is a change too, right? So, like, let's say you have a strong, let's say you're hungry and you're really hungry and you get an orange. That feels good, right?
When they're okay, so
Hold on,
here
just let me
let me
just
approach it
just
from the other side. Let me just approach it from the
well,
other
wait,
side and
wait, wait, wait.
say,
Let's just go through this example though.
okay,
You eat an orange. You're hungry. You're really hungry. You eat an orange. Does that feel good?
I suppose so.
Okay, but after you finished eating the orange, you're not satiated because you haven't eaten for like a day.
Okay.
So your level of hunger after you've eaten the orange or before it is greater than your normal level of hunger would be, right? A normal level of hunger that you would experience as pain, you are now experiencing as pleasure, right? So it's not the absolute level of the motivation that you're experiencing, it's the change. The reduction in the motivation is experienced as pleasure, even though the absolute level of the hunger is higher than it normally would be, because you only got an orange and you went for a day without food. Okay, so if you think through many examples like this, which I have done, this theory makes sense. And the theory that there's not like an absolute. So you don't experience the absolute
What about the
state.
case? What about it the case where your motivation changes, but your overall level of pleasure or pain does not?
Well, give me an example.
For example, let's just suppose. Okay, it's hard. I don't want to like question beg in the example that I give. So, but let's suppose that you wanted that orange and you were hungry, and then you see an apple or think of an apple, and your motivation changes. You're now motivated to eat an apple. And that change in motivation is not associated with any increase of pleasure or pain.
Okay, well, your motivation was to eat, right? The idea of how to satisfy the motivation could be an apple or an orange, and you can, or there are other.
But specifically, by the time you picked up the orange, you were motivated to eat that orange, not just to eat in the abstract.
Sure, but you are motivated to eat in the abstract, or you wouldn't eat the apple either, right? So I mean, like the what you're describing is a change in the target of the motivation or the means of reducing it, but not it's not a change in the level of the motivation. Your level of hunger is the same whether you pick up the
Okay.
apple or the orange. It's
So it's
just
changed the level of motivational sentiments.
yeah. I mean, there's this quality of experience, this negative thing, right? This negative quality that we're calling pain, which is common to all these different kinds of emotions, right? Or it's what makes emotions emotions. They have negative and positive qualities.
Mhm.
Um, the negative experience of being hungry is the same whether you pick up an apple or an orange, whether you think, oh gee, I want to eat an apple, okay, there's an orange. Now if you,
I don't know that they're exactly the same
well,
because
but
when you
if they're
pick up the orange,
different,
your mouth starts to salivate differently than if you pick up the
okay,
apple.
so but
That for me is included in the overall feeling of
well,
hunger.
yeah, well, there might be an overall feeling, but there's the negative quality. If you're just hungry, now if you really are hungry for citrus, okay, then the apple won't reduce the motivation as much as the orange would. But if you're just hungry for food, then it would. So the pleasure you get from the apple or the orange is going to be the same if you're just hungry. But if you're like craving citrus fruit, then or craving an apple, then you're going to get a different change in the motivation because the motivation is different, right? It's got a
Yeah,
different
and
basis. It's
for
not,
me, you're describing a very close connection in to the point of identification in your view between changes in motivational states and overall pleasure, pain, or what I would term the overall goodness or badness of experience. Now, I I think they're different things. I think we will just have to put a pin in that as well and say that we'll agree to disagree there. Um, but I think there's not much more for me to go through on my end. It has been 2 and 20 minutes, and all this talk about eating is actually making me
yeah,
hungry.
yeah, yeah. I'm getting hungry too. Yeah, no, I mean, we probably went off on an unnecessary tangent, but that's fine. The goal of this for me wasn't to like try to explain my theory or to reconcile them or anything like that. I just wanted to talk about your theory and what you meant by it. And I'm gonna say that I still think it does not. It isn't the same as what people mean by morality. I just don't think that's what people mean by morality. Um, I understand where you're coming from. I understand what you're saying. I understand your theory, but I don't think. I think you could just as easily call yourself a moral nihilist with a theory like that. I don't think it counts as a. Um,
Well, the notion that there's objective good and bad consequences in terms of what, in my view, tautologically creatures or subjects will value. There are objective right and wrong answers to what will lead to better states in the future. Now, you disagree with that because you think it all sums to zero. And if you are wrong, if you can think outside of this belief for a second, if you are wrong, my view would hold in that
no,
there
no,
would
no,
be
no. I
right.
mean, even granting that, it still doesn't because you can't say that this event is morally good or bad. Period. There always has to be. It has to be for some experiencer, and I think
Yeah, and that's
that,
exactly what
and
I'm saying.
I
For
don't.
the experiencer, there are right and wrong answers as
Yeah,
to what will lead to a better state.
and I think that is not what people mean by morality. So I don't think that counts as moral. I think that's just value. And we could.
For
It's
true.
it.
If it were true that oh, suppose you're wrong and that it doesn't all sum to zero. If it were true, and maybe like suppose that there's immortality too, okay? Just suppose that it's true that life is going to go on and it's going to get better or worse. If that were the case, if you believe that, you would think that my conception of morality would be pretty much the most important thing, right?
Well, yes, but I wouldn't call it morality. I mean, that's the fundamental point, right? That was the original point of departure. That I don't think what you're talking about is what people call morality, and I think what you're talking about is compatible with moral nihilism. I think you have a hedonistic. You have a. I understand what you're saying. I understand where you're coming from. I think I understand your theory. I just don't think it corresponds to what people call morality.
I think it corresponds to more what the dharmic systems conceive of as ethics or good or bad action.
Yeah, it might, and I don't know because I don't know enough about that kind of thing. But anyway, I guess we could just leave it there because yeah, I'm pretty hungry
Yep.
myself. But yeah, good talking to you, man. We should have some other conversations. I know they get kind of bogged down, but
Yeah. Well, only if it leads to a better overall condition.
so,
Good talking to you.
talk to you later. Okay, bye.